Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening to some of you. Thank you very much for joining our last session on this webinar series. So it's been such an interesting journey that we've taken together for the last 4 months. Today's topic is going to be forecast-based financing, and Stefan has something very interesting to share with us. Let's go right into the session. And as usual, let me remind you to participate, ask questions, unmute yourself if you want to. You can type in the questions on the chat box and I can read it out. So let's make it more of a dialogue. Let's go into the session now. And maybe before we start, I'll invite Marcel, who is on the call with us, to offer the prayer. Are you with us, Marcel?
Yes, sure. Dear Father, we thank you for the day you have given us today and for the opportunity to learn. Please bless this session and bless Stefan, who is going to talk to us, to open our minds and help us to do a better job in the future and learn from what he has to share with us. Thank you for this opportunity, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Let's jump into this and share the screen. Just if we can just confirm, Prabhu, can you all see that?
Yes, we can see it fine.
Okay, great, thank you. And I will close the little window. So if you have any questions, if you type them in the box, or if you just want to interrupt me and ask, please do so. So the topic we're going to cover today is on forecast-based financing. This has also been a little bit of a journey for me. I haven't been, to be honest, that familiar with it. So it's been good to dive into this topic in more depth and to understand what it is, how does it work, and how is it applied, and some examples of where it is applied. And I think you'll probably find this quite interesting, as I found it really interesting to dig more deeply into this. So the whole kind of idea of forecast-based financing is rooted in, I think, what is becoming more and more evident as we work in what used to be the disaster risk management space, then it became disaster risk reduction and into the resilience space. And what we're seeing is more and more about anticipation instead of reaction. And I think there's been a common theme that I've been sort of putting into the discussion that we've had around the whole Sendai Framework and resilience, that it's about being better prepared, and it's not just about managing disasters, but how do we actually anticipate and better prepare. The forecast-based financing concept has obviously been developed by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and it's very much focused on the humanitarian system and kind of reshaping the way the humanitarian system thinks about its work in protecting lives and livelihoods in the event of climatic hazards, which become disasters, and starting to look very much at technologies as a way to do this. The focus of it is very much on weather and weather-based forecasting, but I think you'll see you can probably expand these concepts to other, what I would call, natural hazards. And WFP are doing some of this. What it really focuses on, though, is this idea of extreme weather events, so that you can take action in advance and prevent suffering that normally results when you have this interaction between what I would call the hazard, which is the weather event, and our built environment or the communities we live in. I'm deliberately using these words hazard to avoid going down this disaster management road and continually talking disasters. And you'll see as we go through this, there's a very good reason for that. What I'm also trying to do is focus much more on the risk-based approaches and thinking in terms of risk rather than disaster. And just as a reminder, that disaster only happens when the hazard exceeds our coping capacity and we have destruction, then we have a disaster. The cyclone or the hurricane per se is not a disaster. It's a hazard. And it's a simple change of thought, but it really helps unlock a lot of this thinking. Just as a quick refresher, even for myself, the sort of phases of disaster recovery, I think we're all familiar with. I think those that work in the space, obviously, this is just natural to you, where you kind of start with what was known as disaster risk reduction activities. If an event happens and there is a disaster, because we've now had mass destruction, you go into your search and rescue phase, emergency relief, early recovery, then you start having medium, longer term recovery, and eventually you kind of move back into the development phase. But I think the whole concept about disaster risk reduction, which we've talked at length, and about the Sendai Framework, is really about the risk reduction element. And that then kind of takes you into the risk management space. And what actions do we need to take before something happens? The humanitarian space has generally been very reactive, but I think we're starting to see a much more proactive approach, where we're talking about doing things before events happen, and how do we reduce risk, and how do we reduce vulnerabilities by taking action before things happen. That's why you'll see I move away from the disaster language to talk about risk. And again, this is not just individuals, but it's kind of understanding, what are the risks in a community, and how do we reduce or remove those risks? How do we, you can't always eliminate them, but you can reduce them. And I said there's two ways we can do this in the risk world, is we can either remove the hazard, or we can reduce the impacts that the hazards are going to have. So you can do one of two things, or you can do both. Generally, we know with climate events, there's not much we can do about the hazard. I guess that is debatable if we start talking about climate change mitigation, would be actions we can take to reduce either the frequency or the severity of cyclones. But that's a much broader agenda, I think. And at the community level, it's very hard to do something about the severity of a cyclone, if not impossible. So what you can do is minimize the impacts that those hazards would have. So the aim of forecast-based financing is to try and forecast these extreme events, the extreme weather events that allow you to take early action and then reduce or prevent the human suffering that is normally associated with them. So you can see this is starting to very much talk about the risk language. This is mitigation measures that you implement, but you have to provide finance to undertake those actions. Now, if you think back to the language in the Sendai Framework, it's about investing in risk reduction measures. This is a very good example of that investment, where you need to spend money to do something to implement those actions. So you can see this very much ties into the whole kind of structure as well of the Sendai Framework of understanding the risk, which is where we forecast the hazards. Then we have to invest in risk reduction. And you'll see the other components of this are embedded into this thinking as well. So how does the forecast-based financing work? It's actually relatively simple on the face of it. But as we know, things that appear simple are often quite complex when you start unpicking them. So what the whole underlying principle of forecast-based financing is to release money for humanitarian operations before something happens. And that before is triggered by forecast information and a risk analysis that has been done. And we'll talk a bit more in detail about that. And the idea is that you do early actions quickly and efficiently before, and I'll use the word hazard strikes, rather than the hazard becomes a disaster, and the funds are allocated automatically when certain triggers are reached. So this is all about the kind of preparedness work that gets done. And this is encapsulated in forecast-based financing in what is called the early action protocols or early action protocol. And what that does is it kind of defines the important tasks and responsibilities that need to be done before the event happens. So you can see, again, we're moving very much away from disaster management to risk reduction actions. We're now taking actions to reduce the impacts. Essentially, the architecture of this is built around sort of three components, and we'll unpack some of these in a little more detail. The first component of that, if we start at the top of the diagram, is what is known as the triggers. So the triggers are, what are the things that are going to start the actions? What are the things that are going to release the funds and engage us in doing what we need to do? And the triggers are generally built around climatic forecasts, which become the so-called triggers. And these are then clearly defined and established for different communities, for different regions, for different areas, because as we know, climate is not consistent around the globe. So these have to be done very much in a local area, but it does require expertise and analysis to fully understand what are the natural hazards and to look at the frequency of them, how often do they occur, and what has been the previous impact of those natural hazards. So what you do is you try and benchmark and you define a level at which, when this hazard materializes, it triggers us to do something. And that's the next part of the diagram, which is the early actions. Basically, it just simply means when you reach a certain threshold of your hazard, for example, it could be a cyclone. When it reaches a category 4 and it's within 10 or maybe 100 kilometers from the coast, and there's clear certainty it's going to strike within the next 24 to 48 hours, that could be a trigger, which then means you start your early actions. So that's what they mean by the forecast reaches the specific threshold value and it activates the actions. Now, the early actions are predefined and set up in anticipation. And that's where you also need to do a fair degree of research, understand the historical data, understand what has happened in the past, so that you can develop those predetermined actions, which in effect are your risk mitigation measures. And what you're trying to do is minimize the impact of this event that's going to occur. And in that way, you can start pre-protecting the populations and the communities that are at risk. The last piece of that is obviously to implement these actions, you need financing and a financing mechanism. We'll talk a bit more about the way the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies have done this, because this is very much based on what, this is what their forecast-based financing is built around. But clearly there's opportunity, I think, to engage other stakeholders in these kinds of financing mechanisms. But it's essentially a dedicated mechanism that is set up to allow you to implement those early actions when the triggers have been reached. And that's why, recognizing the need for money, you have to invest in your risk reduction measures. Red Cross and Red Crescent set up a forecast-based fund which allows you to access money to do the actions that are necessary as soon as the trigger has been activated or you reach that threshold. And they've made this available to all of their national societies in different countries. So as I said, this model is very much built around the experience of Red Cross and Red Crescent, but I think it gives you a very good kind of model to work with and to think about. All of these three components are then summarized in the centerpiece, which is known as the early action protocols. And that's where this is all documented and put together and sets out what they call the sort of forecast-based financing protocols or landscape or preparedness. And you will talk a bit more about that. They talk about forecast-based financing readiness. Are you ready to do this? And that also clearly delineates the actions, the roles and responsibilities so that quick action can happen. I think one of the key dimensions to this is, as you know, often the forecasting doesn't give you much advance warning. You know, cyclones can change direction very quickly. Hurricanes do the same. You know, severe flooding. You might have a couple of hours, at best a day or two. So you've got to move quickly. And the whole idea of this is that you're not then scrabbling around deciding who's going to do it, what are we going to do, where are we going to get the money, what approvals do we need, who do we need to consult. You can't go down that road. That's all got to be done, ready and in place before you even start. So that's the kind of key thinking behind the forecast-based financing. I don't know if there are any questions so far. Prabhuk, if anyone has raised a hand or written anything in the chat.
I have not received any questions yet, Stefan.
Okay, good. So if everyone's still with us, we'll move on. So a little bit of a kind of look at the process, what's involved in doing this. Now, as I said earlier, you know, a concept that sounds quite simple on the face of it is actually quite sophisticated and requires a fair degree of knowledge, skills, information, knowledge to implement. And hence, I've gone through, and there's a very comprehensive manual that's prepared by Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. You can just Google it, you'll find it on their website. That sets out all of these steps in details. But we'll just talk through this so that you can get an overview of it and understand how this works. So the manual was created by the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and it's designed for their national societies and for partners to undertake and implement forecast-based financing in a particular country. And I'll just go through each of these stages so that you have a bit more of an understanding what it means. So the first part of this is to commit to forecast-based financing and assess the feasibility. So basically what needs to happen is a feasibility study has to be done in the country or in the region where you want to work, where you consider the landscape, the hazards, you consider the context, and if there is already an operational forecast-based financing system. And the idea is to collect as much information around what is required so that you can assess whether it's viable to set up a forecast-based financing process within the country or in the region And what are the different design options? How would you design such a system? And there you can see they talk about the choice of hazards. So are you talking floods or droughts or other extreme weather events? What are the risks you need to address? Who are the institutions that should be involved, which is very key. Clearly, local buy-in is critical to this because a lot of these mitigation actions that you're going to implement are local and community-based, so you need community buy-in. And then available forecasts, vulnerability and exposure data. And as we know, this can be quite challenging in many locations and countries because, as we talked earlier, the triggers are based on knowledge and information about climatic hazards. And I think, this came out very strongly in some of the tsunamis that happened where there was no early warning system. There was no tsunami early warning system. So without those kinds of systems, you don't have the triggers to activate your forecast-based financing. So it's quite critical that those information technologies and systems exist and have to be fairly reliable, because clearly if you're going to take actions beforehand and nothing happens, yes, you've invested money, but what has actually happened? Are you actually being effective with what you're doing? So there's quite a lot of research that needs to be done to understand whether this can be done. And then part of the study is assessing the potential to reduce the impacts. So what actions can you take to reduce the impacts, to start clearly defining these actions that you need? And again, in terms of our risk language, it's about reduction of impacts, which is really the key here. Again, talking about the institutions, I think quite critical to understand where the information's coming from, what structures already exist, and what do you have in place that you can use to implement a forecast-based financing system. And then, of course, the challenges and the gaps that you need to overcome so the system can become operational. And we've already touched on that point about there is no reliable or usable forecast system or mechanism, or there's insufficient institutional capacity. So you can see there's some quite key elements to this. Engaging stakeholders, I think, as we all know in our development or humanitarian work, stakeholders are critical to this. And as you go through this process, I think you realize that there's a myriad of stakeholders involved in setting up a forecast-based financing system. So it's responsibilities, obviously, between the government, different agencies, the communities. Obviously, the document talks about national societies, but it would be who are the implementers, who's going to kind of own and operate the forecast-based financing system. Government clearly plays a critical role in this, because often government set policy information, they set direction in terms of disaster management and relief operations. They normally have disaster risk management plans for their country. Often it's government ministries such as your Minister of Environment, which might have a weather department that is responsible for gathering all the data. And some of them do have quite sophisticated systems that you'd need to access, the weather services, sharing of risk data. So there's a complex enabling environment that is required in order for this to be effective. So it also depends in some countries on government authorization and approval to implement some of these actions. And often you can see there's very close linkages with your ministries of disaster management and relief, who would be potentially an actor in this and actually implementing some of those actions. So clearly key stakeholders to engage with. And there is a note around integrating this into disaster risk management systems that exist in the country is one of the best ways to ensure the sustainability of it.
Stefan, we have two questions.
Yes.
The first question is actually about, it says, what is a good example of an early action? And I'm wondering whether you want to address that a little later, but I think the next question is relevant to the previous slide. And the question is, does forecast of a certain location to IFRC include local contribution and obligations or responsibilities?
Sorry, Prabhak, the question was, does the
forecast of a certain location to IFRC include local contributions and obligations or responsibilities?
When they say the local forecast, so I'm just not clear what they mean by the local forecast. If the person who asked the question could just clarify.
Yeah, sure. Maybe Marcel, you could unmute yourself and.
Sorry, yeah, Marcel, if you.
Yes, sure. It's a local community that makes the forecast to IFRC, isn't it?
No. Well, in conjunction with the local community, there is a discussion and an agreement on what the local actions could be, if that's what you mean by the forecast actions. Yes, that's very much done in consultation with the local communities on what action should be taken. And so you'll see in the stakeholder engagement process, it's working with those communities to understand their perception of the risk, their perception of the impacts, and then developing jointly the mitigation measures. And the second question around examples, you'll see some of the examples. There's actually one from Bangladesh implemented where it was agreed with the community that giving cash to the community was the best option in a particular circumstance, so that the community would have money immediately available to purchase things, to rebuild their livelihoods. So that was one of the agreed actions. So yes, those actions need to be very much rooted in the reality of what the community will need to prepare for that event.
Thank you.
So if we just quickly, move on to, this is quite an important part about, they talk about making their national societies forecast-based financing ready. And this talks very much to the institutional component of this, because I think as you kind of beginning to see, it requires a fair degree of institutional capacity to do this, because you're going to have the knowledge, the skills, the expertise, not only to do the assessments, to set up the system, but then to actually manage this on an ongoing basis, because clearly these things, will exist for a fairly lengthy period of time. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if there is a trigger, you're going to have the capacity to implement those actions in a very short space of time, and possibly in many different locations or different areas. So you're going to need not only the internal kind of structures, protocols, procedures, but also the human resources to do that. And that's why Red Cross and Red Crescent talk about being finance-based forecast ready. Are you as an institution able to do this? And I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. Although, that this is designed to be anchored and complementary to existing structures, strategies, and plans, it still has to be coordinated by somebody. And it still has to be managed by the institution, and in this case, obviously the National Society that does that. So it requires, as they note, the commitment to forge linkages, to engage with preparedness and response actors, with government, and have those relationships strong, ready to go when the trigger is activated. So I think that's quite a key point in thinking how you do that, whether you have all these resources in-house, whether you need partners to do that, you might need downstream implementing partners, where do you get the financing from? Quite a complex landscape. So I realize this is quite a sophisticated mechanism that has been put together. The early action protocol, I think we've touched on this quite a lot. And this is the central activity and output. And this is what contains that information on the triggers, the early action, and how much funding is required. And you actually pre-allocate funding to those activities, hence the forecast-based financing. You actually forecast the money you're going to spend when the trigger happens. And then it describes, the step-by-step process for implementation. So as you can see, you have everything set up ready to go. So you actually don't need to make decisions around how we do this. You've got your operating protocols. You don't need to make decisions who's going to do it. You've got the resources in place to do it. And it may not be all in-house. It could be resources externally. It could be a disaster management unit within the government that has to react. It could be a variety of actors. And then obviously the last piece is the funding is available, ready to go, and you don't need to start requesting funding. It's all pre-approved, which is the key to this. And so the core components, as I think we've reiterated here, are the triggers, what are the early actions, and then there's a monitoring and evaluation plan and a simulation exercise that can be done to stress test the system to see whether it's ready to go, which I think is quite critical to do so that it will work, and you can also then make adjustments to see what needs to be done to it. Then there's the last sort of stage as well, the second last stage, which is the approval and financing. So once this early action protocol has been developed, tested, and it's been approved internally, then it needs to obtain funding and to make sure that that is available quickly and reliably, particularly once the trigger has been reached. Because again, we reiterate, once you hit the trigger, there isn't time. You have 24, 48 hours to do something. You've got to move quickly. So the IFRC, they've set up their global financing instrument, the Disaster Response Emergency Fund, which now encompasses forecast-based financing to allow their national societies to access money for this. So that's one of the mechanisms that they have done and used. And again, you can see quite a kind of sophisticated organizational structure that's in place to do that, so that they have the financing mechanisms available. The societies develop their EAPs, but they may locally not have money available. So they do need financing for this. And again, I reiterate, investing in risk reduction, it does require resources and money. So where there's a lack of finance locally, this central fund ensures and guarantees that they have financial resources to implement quickly, and that they can fulfill the role that they are set up to do to prevent the suffering before the disaster actually happens. Then the last piece, which kind of closes the loop, is once your EAP is activated, they need to ensure that their society is ready. They develop the AP, it's approved. Once it's set up and in place, ideally, you don't make any more decisions. It's all pre-decided. All you then do is implement. So once the trigger happens, it's activated. And as they point out, everyone should know what to be done, by where, whom, how. It's all pre-decided. So the activation is really kind of the no-brainer, as we say. You activate and you act. All sounds very, very straightforward and simple. The sort of cycle that they use is built around these elements of monitoring the forecasts, which is what you do then. You need a system that will actually continually look at weather forecasts, rainfall patterns, has linkages into the meteorological data, that the organization is constantly updated and aware of what is going on. If the forecast hits the threshold that's agreed, is when this EAP is activated. And the forecast must predict an event of a magnitude and a strength that reaches that threshold. So this is not about saying it's actually happened. This is about saying we forecast that when the cyclone makes landfall in point X, it's going to be a category 4. Storm surge is going to be this high. It's a prediction, and that's what triggers it. But again, we note you need sufficient lead time to carry out the actions, which also presupposes that when you develop these early action protocols, that the actions that are agreed are practical, implementable, and can be done quickly. You know what I mean? A kind of ridiculous case is saying, okay, we're going to trigger the construction of a cyclone shelter. Never going to happen. But triggering cash release to communities, if it's done by electronic payments, can be done almost instantly. So there's a certain practicality to this that I think requires some careful thinking. And that's where I think, Marcel, your question about engaging with the communities to design those actions is really important, because the communities are going to have to be directly involved in this as to how quickly they can implement those actions. Then the legal agreements, everything needs to be in place. We keep coming back to this point. You can't then start arguing about, on what basis are we distributing cash to a community, and, are we sure that we have an agreement with the bank, and does everyone have bank accounts set up? Don't have time for that. It's all got to be predetermined and pre-done. Once it's activated, they move into a stage of monitoring the activation. There's a data collection and analysis piece to assess the impact of that early action, to understand if it's been effective. You evaluate the trigger system so that you understand, was it effective? Did it happen? Give us enough time. Were the thresholds correct? There's workshops to systematize the thinking and the learning, and that obviously is done with the key stakeholders. They do a lessons learned report, which they share with everyone, and then you close the circle by updating the early action protocols. So it's the sort of plan, do, check, act thinking that comes into place here. So that's the kind of circle that's involved in this. Just a little bit more about the triggers, and I think we have talked a fair bit about this, that it's generally related to climatic forecasts and weather-related hazards. As I've kept saying, it does rely on accurate weather data. It relies on accurate forecasting systems. We admit the technologies have improved a lot, and I think there's a huge effort going on globally improve the forecasting of these events. And it's becoming more and more available, this kind of information. So, but it does need a fair degree of, capacity and resources to interpret it, to understand it, and to work with it and use it. But the data is becoming more and more available. It's one thing to have the data on the weather hazard. The other key part of this is to understand what is that weather hazard going to interact with. So if it's going to make landfall in a particular area, do we know what is on the ground? Do we understand what is in the path of the hurricane or the cyclone? What are the condition of the roads, the buildings, the farmlands, the elevations? What is the inundation, the flooding? Because it's only when we interact the hazard with something do we understand the impact. So you need two paths to this. And it's once we understand what the impact of those hazards are going to be, then you can start thinking about your mitigation measures. So again, we've moved very much into the world of risk language. And you'll see they make a very specific point about needing to know what impact a storm or a cyclone or hurricane will have. So it's not simply forecasting what the weather is going to be, but it's what the weather will do is critical here. And I've put in brackets there the definition of risk, which is the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. That comes directly from ISO 31000, the global standard on risk. So the effect is essentially the impact. Uncertainty is the weather. It's uncertain, we can predict, but we're not 100% sure. And the objectives is ensuring the community are safe and no one loses their life. So in simple risk terms, the trigger tries to anticipate the effect and says, once the storm gets to that strength, that's going to be the effect we need to act. So again, I say this, my interpretation of Sendai is very much around this language, dealing with the risk rather than managing the disaster. So it tries to forecast what your impact, your loss and damage is going to be. So the early actions are then very much at the heart of this and very much at the heart of their early action protocol. This talks very much to the mitigation measures in risk language. And the early action is one which has the best chance of helping or supporting the population at risk to reduce negative impacts of these events. And that's why I mentioned this earlier. What are the main impacts the hazard's going to cause? So if, for example, your cyclone is going to make landfall in an area where you've got informal shelters constructed, unless we know something about those structures, we can't really anticipate how many of them could be destroyed. We can't anticipate, if we don't understand the elevations of the ground, how much is going to be inundated by water if there's a storm surge associated with the cyclone. We can't assess the harmful impacts. And this, I think, is still the great challenge in not only the development community, but the humanitarian community, is this more accurate assessment of risk and the impact. Then obviously, once you understand that, then you can start thinking about the actions that best reduce the impacts. So only if we understand what the impact's going to be, can we decide what to do about it. And then the last piece of that, which is also very much embedded in the whole risk language of ISO 31000, is mitigation measures need to be practical and feasible and affordable. Practical and feasible. Can we do them within our existing context? Can we actually, do we have the capacity and the capability to implement these actions? And in this scenario, do we have the time? How long are these actions going to take? And then you decide whether those actions are suitable for a forecast-based financing approach, or are they actually longer-term actions that would kind of sit within our development world? I think this gives you quite a nice linkage between those two in terms of what actions to take. Very quickly, I won't go through this in detail because I've just, to be honest, literally taken this from the website of the Red Cross as an example. I personally haven't worked with forecast-based financing, but it gives you an example of where it's been applied and how it works. I think once you've gone through what we've just been through, you can see exactly how this works. And in this example in Bangladesh, where, yes, the country is very much prone to cyclones, storm surges, flooding, the monsoons. And as I always note, Bangladesh is probably one of the most disaster-prone countries, particularly in terms of climatic events. You can see it starts off by understanding where they're working, what are the flood forecasts, what are the levels of poverty, where are the houses in flood-prone areas. All of that information starts helping you understand what are the impacts going to be of a major flood, which areas, which people, the most vulnerable, the poorest, where are their homes, where are their houses. And once you have that, then you can start developing your actions for implementation. And in this case, when the flooding did occur and the preparatory exercises were done, it showed that some of the best early actions were cash distribution, so that people were able to access money quickly to rebuild their lives, to buy necessary supplies, food, maybe seeds, grains, whatever they required. And there you can see the process and the steps that they went through to develop a forecast-based financing system for this particular region. And an interesting example of a mitigation measure in cash distribution, which when you think about it can be done relatively quickly, relatively simply, and can have a major impact in reducing the suffering of people. There's another example. This comes from WFP in Bangladesh, looking at how they can reduce, again, the impacts of flooding in Bangladesh. And this was done in conjunction with the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, the Bangladesh Meteorological Society. They did flood forecasting, early warning. The Early Warning Center was involved, and how they kind of exchange views on forecasting and anticipating actions that will facilitate and integrate into their SOPs on national disaster risk management plans. So a very good example of what we talked about earlier, working with some of the key stakeholders and working with government and the existing structures to implement these kinds of approaches. There's another example from Africa, though this one was actually focused on extreme drought, the kind of inverse of an extreme flood. And it was starting to think about what are the actions we need to take when we realize that the current weather patterns are going to result in extreme drought in these countries. And as you can see, the actions that came out of this were creation of soil and water conservation structures. Some of those might take a bit longer to construct, which kind of starts leading a little bit into the development agenda. but then distribution of drought-resistant seeds, training of farmers. So it's not always just quick triggers, but sometimes, you know, droughts, you have a little bit more warning and you can realize the weather patterns is that El Nino is starting to develop, which means in a year's time we could experience drought. So sometimes you do have a bit more warning, but you can apply the same thinking and the same kind of approaches to this. So that's just some of the examples. We've got 10 minutes there. I'll probably just stop there so that if people have any questions or any discussion, we can do that now. So thank you very much, Prabhuk and everyone. So let's open the floor.
Sure. Stefan, I was wondering how this forecast-based financing fits into the pathways model. Does it fit into several of the steps in it, or would it be somewhere, would it lie somewhere between the development and the humanitarian streams?
Okay, I would, yeah, that's a good question. I would, depending on the actions that you're going to take and how quickly, I would put it very much, yeah, between the development stream and the humanitarian stream. And why I say that is because the way it's currently structured, the forecast-based financing is, I believe it talks quite a lot to what I call residual risk. So where the development has been completed, and I can use a sort of practical example. Let's say you've built, you've done a housing project in a community, and you know that the elevation of that is above what we might call a 1 in 500 year flood line. So if you have a certain level of rain, that community won't get inundated because you've actually designed for that. But if the rainfall exceeds a certain level, flooding will take place. But what you can now do is you've got a much better ability to predict that, because you know what you've built and designed, and you know what level of flooding you've taken into account in your design. If it's going to exceed that and your prediction comes in and says, hang on, this rainfall event is going to be far greater than you had designed for, that becomes a trigger which then moves into that humanitarian preparedness stream. And this is where I see the discourse between our humanitarians and development people becoming far better and much closer. Because if the humanitarians are trying to predict the impacts, the development people are often the ones who build things or construct things or develop things, and they know to what level of sort of resistance they've constructed. So I think that's where the nexus sits quite nicely between those two. Does that
Thanks,
answer
Stefan.
your
Let's open
question?
it up. Yeah, thanks a lot. Let's open it up to see if anybody has any questions.
Everyone's very quiet. It's obviously been totally clear. You all understand it well and go away and do it.
Maybe I could ask a follow-on question. I think towards the end, Stefan, you shared some sort of practical examples of how the early action protocols that were put in place were sort of tailored to best analysis of what could work quickly and what could work effectively. And obviously that will vary from context to context. And so on. Is there perhaps several more examples that you could help us that would stimulate our thinking a little bit? You know, clearly the cash example with a flood onset where you might have a, 7-day warning of flood onset, that sort of cash distribution pre-positioning prior to flood onset. That's a really good practical example. But sometimes we potentially have less warning, and the needs of the population may not necessarily be met by cash, for example, but there might be other things. Have you got a couple of other examples that you could share that you're aware of?
Brendan, I'm not aware of any, and I was looking through the kind of literature to see. I think this is a relatively new approach, but I can do a bit more research and have a look to see, what I can find. But I think you're right. I think thinking practically about what could be done in a short space of time, that definitely varies from context to context. There is clearly no one size fits all in this. But I think it's sort of an evolving field, which is, I think, moving very much in the right direction. So, yes, so sadly, the short answer is no. And I'm trying to think if I've come across anything, even in working in Bangladesh and places where I would view it as, it may not have been done under forecast-based financing, but it may have been other interventions that could potentially sit, in this space.
Because I could imagine something like a cyclone, for example, perhaps there's less warning opportunity, and what may be appropriate for a cyclone if, say, there's massive destruction potential and markets and other things and banking systems are, potentially, interrupted. How, cash may not necessarily be often cash is the most flexible, but in some circumstances it may not necessarily be the most appropriate, some context. So yeah, just sort of, it'd be kind of interesting maybe if we could reach out to, the Red Cross to see what sort of contexts have really worked for them and how it's functioned in terms of early action protocols and what they've come up with as best early actions to undertake. Yeah.
I mean, even, just thinking out loud here, people like, WFP, if it's even pre-positioning, supplies of food, rather than having a huge warehouse stocked that you're then relying on road networks to distribute, if they have a kind of system where they may have pre-distributed to smaller, safer areas where they know people can access it quickly on foot. I'm just thinking out loud here, but yeah, I think that's the challenge is, how do we design those early actions? So yeah, by all means, I would think, discussions with Red Cross or Red Crescent in the countries would be really useful. How they view this.
Thanks. So our time is up, and we will, I think, have to end our session now. So I just wanted to say a big thank you from my end very quickly before I hand over the time to Brendan, because Stefan was introduced by Nirosha, who conducted our previous webinar series, and then we connected with Stefan, and immediately he said yes, and he has taken us through this amazing journey, and we have all of this on YouTube. So thanks a lot, Stefan, but let me pass on the mic to Brendan.
Yes, thank you, Prabhuk, and I'd just like to extend a very sincere thank you to Stefan for taking us through this journey, and it's been a really interesting one. Unfortunately, due to other things, I haven't been able to participate in all of the program. But the journey that you've taken us on over this 5-session, the introduction to DRR and resilience, the introduction to the Sendai Framework, the sustainability and resilience, the Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction, and now forecast-based financing mechanisms and approaches. All of these things have really been eye-opening for us. We've learned a lot, and definitely as we've taken these things on board, I'm sure all of us who have participated, it's been a great learning journey, and we just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and helping us all to learn and grow. It's just been a wonderful journey. And we really appreciate too the very special spirit in which you have shared with us, and it's been really wonderful. So, and I just want to say a very sincere thank you on behalf of ADRA Asia, but beyond ADRA Asia as well, because we've had participation globally on this for the ADRA network. So just a very sincere thank you, Stefan, for your commitment and staying with us on this journey and leading us. And also I'd like to say a very big thank you to Nirosha, who's introduced us to Stefan, and also to Prabhuk for all the coordination you and the resilience team have done in setting this up and working with Stefan through this whole process as well. Thank you for the whole team for preparing that. So I'll hand it back to you, Prabhuk.
Yeah, sure. That's it basically from my end. We will be in touch with Stefan for sure. Some of you know, and some of our colleagues are here. Stefan's webinars have actually been highly influential in finalizing our resilience policy for the network. So it's really had an impact. So thanks again. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Brendan, for being here today. Stefan will be in touch with you for sure.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Prabhuk, and thank you so much. And yeah, it's just been a pleasure. And again, you know, I'm happy to continue the discussion, and it's been great to connect with ADRA and with the great people and the great work you're doing. Please feel free if anyone wants to reach out or discuss anything. More than happy to support the work you're doing. So thank you.
Just a quick question, Prabhuk and Stefan. I know there's been a, you know, at each of the presentations, there's been obviously a PowerPoint involved. Are they able to be accessed, Stefan, and we can like share them a bit more widely so that even within country office team, they can be, you know, utilizing them as an awareness creation tool? That would be really wonderful if that was possible.
Yeah, certainly, Brendan. I've actually, I think, Prabhuk, I've shared with you all of them except this current one. I'll share that with you now. Then you'll have all the slides. Yes, you know, and as I said, it's, yeah, it's always good to share knowledge and information. So more than happy to do that.
That's really wonderful. A wonderful resource that we can stimulate more wider awareness within our teams in the country offices. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.